I first became concerned about all things nuclear when I was about 16 and I read a book called On the Beach. It was about a nuclear war and everyone got killed. I then went to medical school aged 17 and learned about radiation and genetics, mutations and cancer. Russia and America were blowing up bombs in the atmosphere at that time, and I couldn't understand as a medical student why they were doing this, because it would lead to a lot of disease. I finished medical school, but I was always deeply concerned, and because I was concerned, as I went on, I read every article I could find about nuclear radiation, nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and therefore I became extremely well informed. I wrote my first book called Nuclear Madness in 1978, collating the literature about nuclear power, nuclear waste, uranium mining and the like. So I've been involved really with this issue for 44 years. Even though I'm a paediatrician, I worked at Harvard on the faculty. My specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disease of childhood. And all these genetic diseases, of which there are about 2,600, will all be increased in frequency over generations as the genes in the sperm and the eggs get mutated to increase genetic disease. This is a very serious medical issue. There are about 400 nuclear power plants around the world, none of which are safe. They're all subject to human fallibility and computer error and mechanical error. In fact, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl both melted down in the first 3 or 6 months of their life. So they're very vulnerable when they're young, and they're vulnerable when they're old and their pipes become embrittled and fall apart. Apart from that, each nuclear power plant makes 30 tonnes of intensely radioactive waste per year. The uranium becomes 1 billion times more radioactive when fissioned in a nuclear power plant. This waste is full of several hundred extremely dangerous radioactive elements like cesium, strontium, tritium, plutonium, americium, I could name them. And this waste must be isolated from the ecosphere for 1 million years, according to the American Environmental Protection Agency, which is an impossibility scientifically. So it's going to be leaking within 100 years, whatever container it's put in. Concrete, steel, titanium, they'll all break. And this waste will filter into the underground water systems or above ground streams and then concentrate in the food chain by orders of magnitude at every step. Algae, crustaceans, little fish, big fish and us. And we stand at the apex of the food chain. So these elements concentrate most highly in us. The problem is you can't taste, smell or see them in food or if you're inhaling them. So that waste, and now there are 355,000 tonnes of radioactive waste accrued at nuclear power plants all over the world, including France, Britain, America, Canada and all over Europe. And a study done by the Germans found that children under the age of 5 years living within 5 kilometres of a nuclear power plant have double the incidence of leukemia and have very high incidence of solid cancers. That study was confirmed by a French study and a British study. So it's dangerous to live near a reactor because it's consistently releasing radioactive elements into the air and the water. Each reactor needs 1 million gallons a minute of water to keep it cool, and that water goes back into the lake or the river or the ocean, relatively radioactive, and then the fish concentrate the radiation. So from a medical perspective, nuclear power from every aspect, from uranium mining all the way through to radioactive waste, is extraordinarily dangerous. Furthermore, each reactor makes 250 kilos a year of plutonium, the most dangerous element almost that we know, such that 1/1,000,000th of a gram can induce cancer. But you only need 5 kilos to make yourself a nuclear weapon. And plutonium lasts for up to 500,000 years. So any country that has a nuclear power plant can build bombs. So we're talking about both diseases, epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic diseases, deformed babies, as we see around Chernobyl, caused by radioactive elements crossing the placenta into the developing embryo, And we're talking about long-term epidemics of disease, and then we're talking about possible nuclear war. That's what nuclear power's about. Now, the next form of radiation is gamma radiation, given off by radioactive elements that are made in nuclear power plants, like strontium and cesium, and there are several hundred. Same sort of radiation as X-rays. Gamma radiation goes straight through you, does not make you radioactive, but can mutate genes and cause cancer and other diseases. And then there's alpha radiation, which is particulate. For instance, plutonium is an alpha emitter, so is uranium. An alpha particle is composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It doesn't travel very far in the body. You can hold an alpha emitter in your hand, and the alpha radiation doesn't penetrate the dead layers of skin to damage living cells. However, if you inhale an alpha emitter like plutonium, the alpha particle travels a very short distance. The radiation is very high within that volume, but on the periphery, radiation decreases with the square of the distance. On the periphery of that volume, some cells remain viable, and they will be mutated, and particularly the regulatory gene, and that's what causes cancer. So that's an alpha emitter. Then there's a beta emitter, and beta emitters are cesium and strontium and all sorts of other elements, and that's just an electron escaping from a radioactive atom, but does the same thing. All radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, alpha particles, beta radiation, all induce mutations. No dose of radiation is safe. We think that about 30% of cancers we see now already are caused by background radiation from the sun, the cosmic rays, background radiation from radioactive elements in the earth, or inhaling radon, which is a daughter of uranium. But each dose of radiation you receive adds to the risk of getting cancer. Don't walk through X-ray machines in airports. Don't have unnecessary X-rays. Don't let the dentist X-ray your teeth every year. That's totally unnecessary. My ex-husband was a radiologist, and radiologists buy expensive equipment and they pay it off by irradiating you. If the doctor says you need an X-ray, doctors are not gods, although we play God sometimes, and say, why do I need an X-ray? Is it defensive medicine, or do I really need one? Each X-ray you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer. People who've been irradiated with high doses of radiation to kill their cancers, because rapidly dividing cells are killed by radiation. So we try and focus the radiation, the X-ray, on the cancer, kill the cancer. But some patients who've survived their cancer from radiation therapy, years later, maybe 20 years later, develop another primary cancer from normal cells that have been mutated from the initial radiation dose. CT scans give you a hell of a dose of radiation. Embryos are thousands of times more sensitive to radiation than adults. One X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in that baby. Little girls are twice as sensitive as little boys. We don't know why. Women are more sensitive than men. Children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive than adults, yet the nuclear industry takes a 70-kilogram male aged 26 for the model for how much radiation each human being can receive. But humans are heterogeneous in terms of their response to radiation. Old people are very sensitive to radiation. Immunosuppressed patients are. So we're talking about great danger to the population, both short-term from medical irradiation and long-term, well, short-term if you live near a nuclear power plant or a nuclear waste dump, and long-term from nuclear waste. And if there's a nuclear war, which could occur tonight, and I'm not joking, because for the first time Russia and America are confronting each other militarily since the Cold War, both in the Ukraine and in Syria. And both Russia and America have been practicing nuclear war games, ready to use nuclear weapons. And Russia's got 1,000 hydrogen bombs on missiles, and so does America. And once they're launched, they take half an hour to go from woe to go. Every city in the Northern Hemisphere, be it England, Europe, Russia, China, Canada, America, and many cities in Australia are all targeted. So as one country launches, during that time the other country's satellite picks up the attack, they launch, the missiles cross midstream, the whole nuclear war's over in an hour. And as thousands of cities burn, and the wood and the plastic and the oil and the coal and the black smoke rises up into the stratosphere, there'll be such a cloud of black smoke circling the Earth, it will block out the sun for up to 10 years and we will develop ice age temperatures, and it's called nuclear winter. Most of the ozone will be destroyed too, so if there is any sunlight, you'll get third-degree sunburn in 5 minutes. I could go on and on. So we're talking about, will the Earth end with a bang? Which could happen tonight, because these weapons are there ready to destroy virtually evolution, or with a whimper, with epidemics of cancer, genetic disease, deformed babies, and leukemia. This is the splitting. Einstein said, the splitting of the atom changed everything, all reality, save man's mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. And Einstein at the end of his life said, I wish I'd been a watchmaker, for he predicted these catastrophes. 6 GE Mark I reactors were built at Fukushima, and there was a cliff and going down to the sea, so they excavated the cliff and they built the reactors at sea level. Behind these 6 reactors there's a mountainous range. I knew the 3 GE engineers who designed the reactors, Dale Breidenbach, Dick Hubbard and Greg Minor. And they resigned from General Electric in 1975, saying these reactors are too dangerous and they're subject to meltdowns. They testified before Congress, but one of the major people in General Electric said, if we allow them to be heard and we close down the reactors, that will be the end of the nuclear power industry and we can't afford that. So they built these faulty reactors in Japan. Now what happened was, there was a major earthquake in the Pacific Ocean. It was a grade 9 earthquake on the Richter scale. And then came a great tsunami, a huge tidal wave. So what happened with the earthquake was, it was so profound that the external electricity supply to the reactors was broken. Now the reactors, as I've said, rely on 1 million gallons of cooling water a minute to circulate through the reactor core, which is so incredibly hot as the uranium is fissioning. And if you lose the pumps and the cooling water, then the reactor and the core is so hot, it melts into a molten lava radioactive mass. So what happened was they lost the external power supply to the pumps. However, predicting that could happen, underneath the reactors were huge diesel generators the size of a house. And they were supposed to start if they lost the external power supply. However, in came the tsunami and drowned the diesel generators. So there were no pumps to supply cooling water. Within 3 hours, 3 of those nuclear power plants started to melt down. And the uranium is so hot, it melted its way through 6 inches of steel in the reactor vessel, on and sort of a larval mass onto the floor of the containment vessel, which is concrete. And they can't find the uranium core in reactor 2, and clearly it's melted its way through the containment vessel into the Earth. And the nuclear power industry has always called that scenario the melt through to China syndrome. There was a film made with Jane Fonda and Jack Lemmon called the China syndrome, and it was about such an occurrence. So it's actually occurred, but no one ever predicted in the nuclear industry that there could be 3 meltdowns all at the same time. And that's what happened. And also, as the uranium was so hot, reactions with the water produce huge amounts of hydrogen. Hydrogen explodes if exposed to air. They had a vent at the side of the reactor in case that happened. but there was no way to open the vent. Men had to crawl through a very thin space and manually open the vents, and they couldn't do it. The hydrogen built up in the reactor, and there were massive explosions which blew the roof off the reactor. I think Unit 2, and these reactors have their cooling pools full of extremely hot radioactive fuel 30 feet above the ground on the roof. And this is terribly hot radioactive fuel which has been brought out of the reactor, 30 tonnes a year. And what happened was the cooling pools, they lost their water supply too. They have to be continually cooled. And one of the cooling pools, and I think it was reactor 2, had what they called an excursion, but it was actually a nuclear explosion, which blew bits of the radioactive fuel 500 kilometres away. And bits of it were found, plutonium and stuff, in France and in Sweden. It circled the globe. So we had 4 hydrogen explosions and 1 actually nuclear explosion. For the first 2 days after the accident, the wind was blowing from west to east across the Pacific, so the fallout fell in the Pacific. The Americans brought their aircraft carrier, USS Reagan, right up to the coast next to Fukushima, and all those personnel on that ship got highly irradiated. Many of them are now getting cancers and the like. Some of their children are being born deformed because the genes were mutated in the sperm. Then the wind changed and blew towards the northwest of Japan, and the government didn't want to warn the people about what was happening because they didn't want to create panic, which was really medically totally irresponsible. So thousands of people, hundreds, fled into the path of the highest radiation dose and had very, very high levels of exposure. And the Japanese government didn't inform the people of the world, let alone Japan, that there had been 3 meltdowns within a few days. They didn't tell anyone for 3 months. There's a total cover-up in Japan. The Japanese government has passed a secrecy law so that any reporter reporting on the truth could be jailed for 10 years. The doctors have been told not to tell the patients their symptoms could be related to radiation. Already, of the children under 18 in the Fukushima prefecture have been looked at and examined by ultrasound. 127 of them have developed thyroid cancer. The normal incidence of thyroid cancer in that paediatric population is 1 or 2 per million. That's the tip of the iceberg because thyroid cancer appears really early. Then leukemia starts appearing at 5 to 10 years. We know this from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki data and also from Chernobyl. And then solid cancers such as breast, bowel, lung, brain, you name it, start appearing 15 years later, and there are still solid cancers appearing 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the incubation time for thyroid cancer is 2 to 4 years, leukemia 5 to 10 years, solid cancers 15 to 80 years. So we're sitting on a medical catastrophe. The Japanese government and the International Atomic Energy Agency, who are working closely with the Japanese government because they want nuclear power to continue, they're only looking at thyroid cancers. They're not looking at any other cancers. They're not collecting the data. The only truly scientific data is being collected by an evolutionary biologist called Tim Mousseau, who is going into the exclusion zones around Chernobyl and Fukushima at the risk to his health and looking at birds and animals to see what's happening to them. And he's found that the barn swallows, which he's examining, they have smaller than normal brains, 40% of the males are sterile, all of them have mutations like crooked wings and abnormal feathers, tumours are rife, the birds have cataracts in their eyes, which is a known effect of high radiation doses. What happens to barn swallows happens to humans, which is why we in medicine test our drugs on animals before we use them on humans to see if they're safe or not safe, because we're all basically the same biological system. So nuclear accidents never end, And now we've got a ghastly accident in Fukushima, and every day since March the 11th, 2011, 300 to 400 tonnes of highly radioactive water have poured into the Pacific every day. And that's 4 years. And there's no evidence that that will ever stop, because from the mountain range pours down huge amounts of water underneath the reactors. When the reactors were intact, that was fine, but now the molten cores are in the earth and available for the water to suck out the radioactive elements, and then it flows into the ocean. So the Pacific Ocean is becoming more and more radioactive. It's a big body of water, but because of the food contamination and the bioconcentration in the algae, crustaceans, little fish, big fish, us, you know, fish swim thousands of miles. So no one's testing the fish on the west coast of Canada or America. Fish could swim down to Australia. You don't know you're eating radioactive fish because you can't taste, smell or see it. So it's a silent, insidious, cryptogenic killer. When I went to America in '78, I was deeply concerned about nuclear war, but also nuclear power. And I had dinner with the editor of the New England Journal, who asked me to write an article about nuclear power for that very prestigious medical journal. I took a year in the Cantway Library at Harvard researching the issue, wrote an article which I submitted to the journal, which was rejected by peer review because they said, well, you didn't say what's good about nuclear power. And I said, medically, there's nothing good. It's like saying, well, smoking? Yeah, there are some good elements medically about smoking. So the paper was rejected, but I became well informed. Now, I then put together a full-page ad in the New England Journal about the medical dangers of nuclear power, and it was published serendipitously the day after 3 Mile Island melted down. I'd started Physicians for Social Responsibility, and suddenly we had 500 new members. We were operating out of a broom cupboard in a little office in Harvard Square, and we just started to proliferate. Over about 5 years, we recruited 23,000 doctors. We had 153 chapters all over America. And I taught those doctors how to go on television, on radio, and talk about the medical dangers of nuclear power and nuclear war, and to write letters to the editor, write articles and the like. So we absolutely covered America with information about nuclear war. The Americans learnt about this, and I was often on television with film stars like Sally Field, Lily Tomlin and the like, who supported me. Phil Donahue and Paul Newman supported me. I spoke in the Playboy Mansion before a whole lot of film stars. And Patty Davis was there, who was Reagan's daughter. And she came up to me afterwards and said, I think you're the only person on earth who can change my father's mind about nuclear war. Will you see him? And I said, well, yeah, but I don't want Miss Baker or Diva there, his advisors. I'll see him alone. So she rang me 2 days later and said, we've got an hour at the end of his working day. And I said, what time is that? She said, 4 o'clock, which was a little worrying. And we swept into the southern portico of the White House in Secret Service cars. We went into the downstairs library, in which there wasn't a single book. We waited a little while, and in came Reagan. He was very dithery. He didn't know where to sit. So I went and shook his hand and said, hello, Mr. President. And I said, you sit there and I'll sit here. So I had an hour and a quarter with him. Only me. Patty sat there, didn't say a word. And I said, you probably don't know who I am, do you? He said, yes, you're an Australian doctor and you're scared of nuclear war. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I too am scared of nuclear war, but our ways to prevent it differ. I believe in building more bombs. So we're off to a wonderful start. I'd just written my book called Missile Envy, and I just knew all sorts of information. Everything he said to me was factually inaccurate about CIA organisations, about blue-green laces, about weapons in the air, about everything. So he'd say something and I'd stop and correct him, but he got quite anxious. So about half the time I held his hand to reassure him. And so quickly I developed a doctor-patient relationship with him, which was interesting. And I estimated clinically his IQ to be about 100. He was a nice old man. He would have been a good chicken farmer. Anyway, I thought, well, I'd had no influence at all, but After that, shortly after that, he started to say nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won. Also, a film was made called The Day After about a bomb dropping on, I think, Oklahoma, and almost every American watched that. And there were psychological people counselling children afterwards. I mean, it was very profound. And in 5 years, from most people saying better dead than red, 80% of Americans were opposed to nuclear war. Reagan then started working with Gorbachev, who'd seen us doctors on television in Moscow talking about nuclear war and the medical effects. And that movement brought an end to the Cold War. Many people will come up to me and say, I think you prevented a nuclear war. I actually was the leader of that movement. We got 1 million people in Central Park. I had 3 minutes to talk to 1 million people, an ocean of faces. I thought, what am I going to say? So I dropped the bomb on them and vaporised them and described all the medical implications. It was a very profound time. And who knows, you know, if I stopped a nuclear war or not, because we didn't have one. So you don't know, do you? But you do the best you can. And then we got George I, who got rid of a few bombs unilaterally to help Gorbachev to bring all his weapons back from the Ukraine and various provinces to Moscow. And then we got Clinton, who left the weapons in place. We gave him the ability on a silver plate to get into Air Force One, to fly to Yeltsin, who was a very bad alcoholic and totally compliant with America, and say, Boris, sign here, we're going to abolish nuclear weapons. He had 80% of Americans behind him, but he left the weapons in place. And for that, I'll never forgive him. And for that, if there's a nuclear war tonight, that's Clinton's legacy. What can I say? The nuclear waste from nuclear power, no, it will not end the human race, but there are over 2,600 genetic diseases, of which my specialty, cystic fibrosis, is one of the most common, and many of my patients died in childhood. Diabetes, hemochromatosis, dwarfism, mental retardation, Tay-Sachs, I could go on and on. Those, because most mutations in the eggs and sperm cause deleterious mutations or mutations for disease. Very few mutations are advantageous. However, it's the mutations over time that induced evolution, how fish developed lungs, birds developed wings, how we evolved, but it took billions of years for that to happen. Now, almost all mutations are deleterious and cause disease, so we'll see a genetic dissolution, if you like, of the human race, but not just humans. All animals and all plants have genes as well. So we're doing a terrible, terrible thing by increasing the background level of radiation by orders of magnitude in various parts of the world. And it will eventually become ubiquitous as the radiation spreads everywhere, i.e. what's happening to the Pacific Ocean now with Fukushima. There is no safe level of radiation. I repeat, there is no safe level of radiation. Each dose of radiation you receive is cumulative and adds to your risk of getting cancer. That's absolutely documented in the medical literature. But the nuclear industry will say, well, there are safe doses, and they're even saying, well, a little bit of radiation is actually good for you, and that's called the theory of hormesis. They lie and they lie and they lie. In science, it's irresponsible, to say the least, to lie. If I lied in medicine, I'd be killing my patients or damaging them, and I would be deregistered. For scientists to lie is immoral. The nuclear industry, A, they're not radiobiologists, B, they don't understand medicine or genetics or anything, yet they make the laws, they make the standards by which they operate. Incidentally, I will say that the nuclear industry in America is encouraging the Japanese to open their reactors again, because the nuclear industry is a very wealthy industry, and Japan makes the containment vessels for nuclear power plants. They export it to Turkey and to all over the world. And so they want to continue operating their invidious, dangerous, immoral industry. Nuclear power now is economically ineffective. Solar power has a huge resurgence. It's becoming cheaper by the day. You can have windows inserted into your house that you can see through that are solar panels. Wind power is increasing enormously. It's cheap, very cheap. It costs $12 to $15 billion to build a new reactor. The 400 or so reactors in the world are reaching the end of their lifetime, and they're all going to be closed down. The reactor itself is radioactive waste. It has to cool for about 60 years before you can use robots to cut it apart. So we're leaving the age of nuclear power and nuclear reactors and entering the infinite age of radioactive waste. My message to the world is for people to educate themselves. I've written about 8 books about these subjects. Go to my webpage, HelenCaldicott.com. Get the books and read them. Question everything. Use the internet to answer your questions. Use critical thinking. Become well informed. And once you understand what I've been talking about in depth, you will go through a process of grief. Like I've told you, you've got cancer. The first stage of grief is shock and disbelief. Well, I can't believe her. She said one thing wrong, so I'll wipe everything else off. Next stage is depression. Quite profound sometimes, may last days to several years. Go through your depression. It's very important to psychologically experience that. The next stage is anger. Railing against God, why did I get this cancer? Or railing against the powers that be. Anger is a very important emotion if focused in a white-hot beam. I'm going to go and see the president. I'm going to go and chain myself to the fence in Congress and talk to the Congress people. I'm going to do whatever. But out of those feelings, the psyche evolves and you suddenly know what you have to do. No one's ever told me what to do. I just know. And mostly when I'm in the garden, very quiet, or walking in nature, I get the messages. I know what I have to do. Don't do what other people tell you to do, because it will never work. And you each have your own extraordinary ability and capacity to do your very own thing.